How's it going, everybody? I wanted to engage with this Blair White post from a little while ago. Blair White writes this: I am a transsexual and disturbed by the blatantly inflammatory prioritization of Trans Day of visibility above Easter by Biden and the establishment. It led me to a decision about something brewing in me for a while now. I'm going to try going to church for the first time. I'm going to do my best to set aside sort of the sort of political element here. It's going to be impossible to sort of separate the two, but I really actually want to focus on the second part of this post. A decision about something brewing in me for a while. That actually caught my attention because I picked up on something during Blair White and Joe Rogan's podcast a couple of years ago that I highlighted on this channel. I'm going to try going to church for the first time. And this is where I have as a Christian person, as a person who looks at the world as best as I can through a biblical Christian worldview, this is going to be an interesting thing if Blair goes to church. What church will Blair find? What people will Blair find there? I was listening to this Kat Von D, Theo Von interview, and Kat has had an interesting experience. Kat recently was baptized and is going to church and is finding that some people look at her strangely, and that's unfortunate. That is unfortunate because I think that the church should be a place for Kat Von D to go. The church 100% should be a place for Blair White to go. And the reason for that is that actually the people who go to church have far more in common with Blair White than maybe Blair or the people going to church realize, because the church is a place for people seeking transformation, seeking harmony. We all feel a little broken and a little dislocated and a little uncomfortable in our own bodies. And there is a deep desire for transformation. And I think that's what I was picking up on here during this interview with Joe Rogan that Blair did a couple of years ago.
NPC? As like an NPC, like you don't have like a soul because you didn't really connect with like any beings. You just saw pretty colors, you had a very simple experience. You know what I mean? But I had the opposite from after doing DMT. I see so much more humanity in everyone I'm around. Like I feel very changed after doing DMT. It's a very profound experience. And like I'm just noticing more things about people. I'm being more aware of like their body language when they talk to me. And I think it was a very positive thing doing DMT. And my experience was the closest thing to a spiritual experience I've ever had, because I've never been a person that's been terribly connected to like anything larger than me. I've never been religious, never been spiritual. And I'd say it was the closest to like a spiritual thing for me.
I think it is a spiritual thing.
Yeah.
I think it's an undeniably spiritual thing. That's the thing about it, is like it forces you to think about love and connection and the bonds that people have with each other in a way that you don't get from anything else. The powerful experience of a transcendent psychedelic moment, it's not like anything else you experience in life other than maybe like a near-death experience.
I think that this conversation is profound because, again, I'm picking up on a theme here with Joe and with Blair, and it's the desire for transformation. It's the desire for some form of ascendancy, and they're talking about DMT as though DMT is a thing that can unlock that. And I've done some other podcasts that deal with DMT more specifically if you're interested. I think that the spiritual world and the material world form a complete reality, and so how do you access that? Well, can a natural substance change you in the way that you're seeking, right? So there's a few things that they said right there that are really interesting. Blair said, I feel changed, and that's a clue that the desire is transformation. But then the question is, can a substance, just a natural substance like DMT, do a complete transformation that I think is deep inside each and every one of our hearts? Blair says, I've never been a person connected to anything larger than myself. That's the search for meaning, right? That takes you higher beyond yourself. Do we find that inward, or are we looking outward? then Joe says, like, the love and connection and the bonds that people have, you don't, in this sort of transcendent psychedelic experience, he says you don't get anywhere else. And actually his quote, I wrote this down just to make sure I got it correctly. The powerful experience of a transcendent psychedelic moment is not like anything else you experience in life other than maybe a near-death experience. I thought that was interesting too. And there's some science there, and I'll try not to go too much into the DMT, but DMT is present in the body. It's just that we're metabolizing it. And yet at these moments, it seems like that you can have these sort of psychedelic moments or near-death experiences. And my thought there was that, well, when you become near death, you're becoming nearer to your creator. You're becoming nearer to God in that sense. And that's really what we're looking for. That we have this deep, locked inside our hearts, this deep desire for transformation, because we also have this deep desire to connect with our creator. And there's something that's a barrier there. There's something that, and I don't know, that's not what Joe and Blair specifically are saying, but I'm picking up on some themes, and those are things that I wanted to say. So I'm hopefully not being dishonest to their conversation. Hopefully you can see their conversation in context. Of course, you can go watch the podcast. But is there more there? Something more than what DMT could get you. Again, as a biblical Christian person, I'm like, yes, what you're looking for is actually, it's really a harmony kind of with what's going on, this dissonance or something going on inside of us. It sort of reaches out to connect to God, who is not inward. God is not inside, but God is outside. But the inside of us wants to connect. I don't know. I'm not making any sense here. Anyway, so DMT. I think when people have these DMT experiences, it is a clue that what we long for inwardly is a deep connection to our Creator, who is beyond us.
Because, like in the Bible, homosexuality in the Old Testament is frowned upon, but so is eating shellfish.
Right.
So is wearing 2 different types of cloth.
And you're supposed to stone your kids if they talk back.
Oh.
I don't think conservatives really do that.
There's a lot of shit in the Bible that's very wacky. But they concentrate on the gay one for some... I don't know maybe back in the time. See, one of the major theories about the advent of Christianity has to do with psychedelic drugs.
And again, I did a podcast on the connection between the origins of Christianity and are they really connected to the psychedelic drugs. You can check that one out. But for me, the question there is, why, if it's true, and I think it is probably true, why does the church focus on these sexual sins or sexuality, sexual sin? This I think is really part of the conversation that we need to be having. For the Christian person, the body is sacred. The body it's created by God for a purpose. Sexuality is sacred because it's pointing to a mystery. It's pointing to something beyond. Why is it that we're always chasing sex? Why is it that we're always chasing power, because there's something, we have a longing, and I think particularly for sex. Power is a chase. We're trying to have control because we don't want to surrender control. But sex is this sacred thing that points to something. It is beautiful and wonderful in and of itself, but that beauty and that wonder are actually pointing us. It's another clue that there's something beyond. This is Paul writing in Ephesians. So husbands, you ought to love your wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. But as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. And so for the Christian person, the body is sacred, sexuality is sacred. We're pointing to something. It is Christ is the bridegroom, and we collectively are the bride. We're a part of that bride of Christ. And as weird as it is to talk about sort of consummation, which is something that we do talk about in Christianity, like is it that Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is the bride as a husband and wife in the physical world are? No, not quite. A husband and wife are joined together in one flesh in a way that is pointing to something beyond it. And so though we use this language, and it is a little bit weird, I'll be completely honest with you, again, we're pointing to something beyond that. And I think that there's a lot of our society is broken. And so human sexuality is part of that brokenness. Relationships are part of that brokenness. And so it's hard, I think, sometimes for us to see the beauty of these things in amongst a bunch of mangling and sort of brokenness that we see in society and culture today. And so Christians, the church maybe does focus on the sexual sins, and maybe there's an imbalance there, like Joe's point. It's like, yeah, eating shellfish and all this other stuff, it's all lumped in. Now that's Old Testament law that maybe for another podcast for another day, but ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Maybe there's an imbalance there, but I think one of the things that I would hope to do with this podcast is encourage the church to be conversant with culture when it comes to the sanctity of the body and of sexuality, because I think that there's a vacuum there, and people are searching for answers that for me, I have found in Scripture, in the person of Christ, and in the community of people that we call the church. And I think as people are seeking answers, the church could be in a position to take part in that conversation in a beautiful way. This was Blair. Joe and Blair talked a couple of years ago. This is Blair a couple of months ago, so maybe 2 years after that, in a counseling session where Blair opens up about some stuff that I think is really important, frankly.
And there is like a version of me that's not necessarily right here that is pulling the strings, and not even in a manipulative way, but like a I got you way. Like I've always...
Is that God?
Maybe.
Do you have a relationship with God or some higher power?
Well, God's a funny word, and I have a lot of, more, conservative audience who feel very strongly about God and specifically what that means, which is, to most of them, it's going to be Jesus and the Holy Spirit and Christianity or Catholicism. For me, I'm really not at like believing in God in a religious sense, but I just know there's something else. Like I can just feel it.
Where'd that come from? Where is that just an intuition?
Yeah. Ever since young, and I only sort of now recognize it as somewhat of a spiritual intuition. But I remember having these thoughts on a more basic level as a kid. Like I remember telling myself, this isn't even real. Like all these people are operating in ways like there's something else pulling the strings for how everyone's operating.
Interesting.
And
something's going on underneath or above. That is making all this happen, and you intuited that.
Yeah.
And so you can hear these themes again, connecting with God. God is sort of beyond. There's something controlling things. This is providence that we're talking about here. We're not using that word, but there's something beyond just this world. And there's an intuition that we feel. I'm working my way through The Master and the Emissary with Ian McGilchrist, and Ian McGilchrist pointed this out in the Jordan Peterson interview that he did, which is like, in modern like Western culture, we've abandoned this idea of intuition as though it's silly, you know, and yet it's not silly. There's something there, and we need to listen to that sense of intuition, maybe, or whatever, or what have you. Now this next part is really interesting, and I would just ask you to hang in there with me. I know we're a ways into the podcast already, but hopefully you're hanging in there to listen to everything I say before assuming you understand what I'm going to say about Blair or about this topic. I really am just more talking about the biblical view of sexuality and the biblical view of the body, and I'm not necessarily wading into the political charged nature of this conversation, though I acknowledge that it's there, and I'm assuming some people are going to come on to this podcast and leave their comments, and that's fine. But I would just ask you to listen to the full conversation before assuming you know where I'm going here. Because this next part is really interesting, and you don't hear this brought up in the conversation much.
But, you know, when I transitioned, I never knew anyone like that. Never really heard of it. So I was like, okay, then that's my big problem in life. You know, I'll move on now.
Right. It's solved.
Yeah. Now I see that, like, that was probably a trauma response. Me being trans is probably a trauma response.
That's interesting.
And it's not politically correct to say, don't care. That's not, you know, within the realm of what people think is acceptable to say. And some of their reasoning for that, I understand. I don't think that is the case for every person who is trans. I don't think that's the case for every LGBT person. And it may not be the full explanation for why I'm trans in myself, but to deny that it's part of the equation, I just think is ignorant in my own case. Deny that it's part of the equation, I just think is ignorant in my own case.
Right. When did you come to that realization that it was, at least some aspect of it was a trauma response?
Like in the last year or so, like I started really thinking about it, and I'm like, you know, really interesting how I escaped my hometown, escaped my family, moved away, changed my name, changed my physical appearance in just about every way I possibly could. I mean, I look nothing like I look. It's actually scary how different I look, like shapeshifter type stuff. And I don't think that's normal, like, and even less normal than like a regular abnormal sense, because like abnormal is like not good or bad, it just deviates from normal. But for me, I was like, no, there was like something unspoken about that I'm not admitting to myself. Like, was that me running away from my past? And I think in part, for sure.
Right. Well, also, when our childhood is really, really scary, we don't want to be in our bodies. Like, we don't want to be in our actual bodies because it's not safe to be in our bodies. And we have all kinds of ways that we leave. And so maybe there was something about you not wanting to be in your actual body, or you wanted to change your body in some way. Does that track for you?
Well, and longing for safety, not wanting to be in my body really means I desperately want to be safe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's the full explanation.
Sure.
You know.
Do you have regrets?
With transition? No.
No. You're comfortable with where you're at right now?
More than comfortable. And that's actually the reason why I think people don't want to admit to themselves sometimes that maybe transition is partly a trauma response, is because they don't want to put it out there that like somehow it makes it less valid or not really them or a costume of sort.
Right.
And for me, the way I've thought about it is like, look what my body did to allow me to survive. Like, the trauma response is literally a survival mechanism. That's what they are. So my body did this crazy elaborate thing, and I'm still here, and I'm the only successful person in my family, and I'm the, only person who's even began to look at these toxic patterns they all have that I broke.
Right.
It's like, to look at that and be like, that means I'm not actually Blair or something. I am Blair because I chose to be Blair.
Yeah.
And I still am Robert. I still am that person too.
Right.
You know, I'm all of it.
Okay. So naturally, there's a lot to unpack here. And when you start talking about trauma, things become very real. Everybody has a personal interaction with that word. Pain, trauma, our experiences are our own. There's a couple things. My body did this crazy elaborate thing is a really interesting sentence. It's a really interesting way to explain what has happened. My body did this thing. But is this a natural process like a metamorphosis? Is that what we're talking about? Or is there more going on there? Like, well, my body didn't do this thing. I did this thing to my body. Now, Blair will say, it's really interesting because my voice never dropped, and I always walked a certain way, and so maybe there's this sense at which I always experienced life a little bit more feminine than my biology, and I get that. And in my own personal experience, I was raised by my mom. My dad is around, but not much. I very much, growing up, very much understood the world through sort of a feminine lens more than a masculine lens. And so I sort of can sort of understand that, obviously not in the same way Blair can. But is there a metamorphosis that happened naturally? And of course, that's where, again, it just becomes a very interesting way of saying what actually happened. Because what actually happened was not a natural metamorphosis process. And I go back to Paul, it's sort of the light bulb pops on in my, the light bulb goes on in my mind. And I think, okay, Paul writes this in Romans, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice. Holy, right? Living, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And so you come into the biblical worldview and you realize the physical world of the body and the spiritual world are united. It's one world that God created. And yet again, the Bible is being very intentional about the sanctity of the body and even its connection to this spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by what? By the renewing of your mind. And so what Scripture is telling us here is that this transformation is preceded by another process of renewal. It is the renewal of the mind, this metanoia. You can look at Matthew 3:8. You can look at other passages that are going to use that word metanoia. And what it seems to me is that metanoia precedes metamorphosis. This, to me, is really what Blair is getting at. This is really what the conversation for me gets at. We are transformed, not because of what we do to ourselves, but because of what God has done. And repentance is also an interesting word because I'm not focusing anymore on the patterns of this world, and my attention, going back to Ian McGilchrist and Jordan Peterson and those conversations that we've had on this podcast, my attention no longer is of the things of this world and the material, of the things of this world, but now I've turned my attention to God, and beholding is becoming. Like I look at God, and there's something here that's just beautiful and profound and sort of mysterious, and yet the way the world is portraying it is a mangling of this beautiful thing that God has given us, this promise of renewal, and that see in this transformation that Paul is talking about in Romans 12, it is in line, in harmony with our bodies being holy. We don't have to manipulate our physical form, our physical body. The holiness of that can be maintained and sustained, and yet transformation is still possible. You go forward as you are into communion with your Creator. But if you don't have any regrets, you won't find what you're looking for in a church, because the church is a community filled with regrets because of our own self-imposed trauma, because of our own brokenness and our own sin. That's who we are. That's who the church is. We are imperfect people longing for the day that we can be transformed. That's this tension of already but not yet. And so it's a future hope, but it's also a present reality. We are a people who are longing for that. And we are painfully aware of our own failures and our own regrets and our own mistakes. And that's what the church is. It's a community of people who come to the table of Christ. This is another Twitter post, which I thought was sort of interesting, though I might have posted it slightly different. Is this the table of Christ where all are welcome? Yes, I would agree with that. It's an invitation. It's a universal invitation that the God-man Jesus puts out there. And where many people are going to find the tension is in conflating the invitation with affirmation. This is his table. It's a universal invitation to his table. It's not my table. I didn't set the table. If I want to feast at the table of the Creator, I come to the table on his terms and not my own. And I'll say this, nobody comes to this table without being transformed. We're all transformed at the table of Christ when we enter into communion with him, he who has the power to truly make us new. I love this Dan Allender. Why are you doing that to me? And the work that Dan Allender is doing. If I could point you to anything, it would be his book, The Healing Past. The Healing Past? It is about healing of the past. It's about the healing path and the trauma that's in our lives and the fact that it can be there for a reason if we bring that trauma to the feet of God.
To move forward, you've got to have dry socks to be able to fight a war. And in this sense, you've got to be able to care for your body to fight the spiritual wars that we're each called to address. So if we can start with a very, very simple assumption, our bodies reflect the glory of God, and our bodies are what evil brings harm against most ostensibly and clearly. And therefore, for our lives to not attend and tend to good to our bodies actually ends up creating more of the harm evil desires. So if we will tend to our body and begin to read our body and begin to understand how abuse has affected our body, then we have a way to tend to our body with far greater care than we have allowed ourselves before. And that kind of care becomes a way of not only creating nurturance, but it's also the way that we open our bodies to taste grace. Taste and see. That's the simplest phrase in the Psalms. Taste and see the goodness of God. Will you let your body receive goodness? Will you know that, no, you need to rest. You need to walk slower. You need to tend to your body and to allow the stress, the anxiety, the tensions that you have suffered, not to be just chilled out by watching a couple hours of TV, having a couple beers, smoking a cigarette, and then somehow ramping yourself back up into the world of stress again. But what would it mean for you to actually have a portion of a day where you simply sit meditate, reflect, allow your body to come down and to feel something not just of the pulse of intensity, but something of the pleasure of good care. That's too hard for people who have a history of abuse, where shame intersects with judgment and contempt, where we are far more comfortable pushing our bodies to a point of danger and actually excess. That kind of style of relating in our world makes sense for those who have been abused or have known great harm, but actually it only sets us up to, in many ways, become our own body's abuser. Yes, we were abused, and yes, we must deal with that harm. But if what we're doing with our bodies currently is only intensifying the very structures for how we cannot and will not enter into those stories, then we're repeating the past in the way we're caring for our body today. And when we do that, we are joining the abuse. 20, 30, 40 years later, we are actually becoming our own abuser rather than opening the door to joining God and his redemption and joining the process of being able to play in the goodness of God.
Man. And so you hear some of the similarities there between what Dan is saying and what Blair has even said. And again, I hope people can hear that what I'm really pointing at is as a Christian person, I think the church can engage in this conversation in a very unique way because of the claims of biblical Christianity, because of the nature of the body as created by a loving creator. Even the word play that Dan Allender just brought up, the true enjoyment of what we were made for. It's C.S. Lewis is like, we fuss about with drinks and sex, and when infinite joy has been offered to us. Now, of course, I think sex in its proper context is, beautiful and points us to that infinite joy. But I really do hope that you can hear what I'm saying is there's literally, if you could hear anything, I'm approaching this conversation the same way Jesus approached the woman who was caught in adultery. All the people were coming to him. He sat down. He began to teach them. Scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. And having set her in the center of the court, they said to her, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery." But when they persisted and asked him, he straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw the stone at her." And he stooped down and he wrote in the ground. And when they heard it, they began going out one by one, beginning with the older ones. He was left alone, and the woman, where she was in the center of the court. Straightening up, Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Does no one condemn you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go from now on and sin no more." That would be the perspective that I'm taking. And yet, unfortunately, it seems that we don't take that perspective often enough. Like I said, people in the church have far more in common with Blair White than maybe most people, even Blair, are aware of. We are all people in deep need of transformation, metanoia, renewal. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time, this is Romans 8:18, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in the hope that creation itself will also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, awaiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. We all wait eagerly with groaning. We have an urge. We have an intuition that this is what we truly need. We all want. So we all have this desire, and we all come to the table of Jesus, and we commune there with him. We turn our attention from the things of the world to true worship of our Creator, and we are transformed. Little children, what we are has not yet been revealed, but we know when we see him, we will be like him. We wait eagerly for our adoption as sons and the redemption of the body. Thank you for being with me in this one. Really would love to hear the comments. Really not sure how certain platforms will handle this conversation, but I hope that you can hear that the church is a place. The church is a place, hopefully, that when Blaire White shows up, Blaire White is received into that communion. Because it's a communion of broken people desperate for transformation, who have found the answer, which is beautiful, The answer, and the reason the body is sacred is because Jesus makes it sacred. So I will catch you in the next one.